So welcome to our podcast today. We are looking forward to a very interesting conversation about the current state of retail and how that impacts business strategy going forward. Lots to talk about, but the first thing I'd like to do is introduce our esteemed guests. And I'll start with myself. I am Matt Salmonson. I'm the head of forecasting and inventory operations at an up-and-coming e-commerce retailer, Quince. In addition, we had Tom Bianculli, the CTO at Zebra Technologies, Yogesh Kulkarni, the co-CEO at Antuit AI, and Brendan Witcher, the VP and Principal Analyst with Forrester, with his research focused on digital business strategy. So a great group, and looking forward to an interesting discussion. So Brendan, why don't we start with you? With everything that's happened in the last 2 years, how would you describe the capabilities of a modern retailer, and how would that be different than what existed the prior 2 years?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a great way to start off the conversation because I think that a lot of retailers today, they're struggling to keep up with the customer, and that's a rather banal platitude that everyone kind of says. But the challenge that most retailers have is they just don't know what to do about it. There's so many options, there's so many things they could do. They're trying to figure out what they should be doing. So, and that becomes more difficult because each retailer has their own path forward as far as being able to serve the needs of their customers. So what Starbucks does shouldn't be what Macy's does, shouldn't be what Dick's Sporting Goods does, right? And so as we look at the landscape of things people should be working on, we find that the challenge is mostly around just figuring out what's the right technology and right investments that I need to be making right now. And that's been different than the last few years, which everyone was just trying to everyone should work on e-commerce and everyone should start making recommendations and everyone should start, doing, voice recognition and working on mobile, right? There was a general movement of people moving to the same things at the same time. And we've really just blown that apart right now at this point.
So Yogesh, you've been focused on advanced analytics and AI for quite a number of years at this point. How, as things have changed, has that changed the analytical challenge for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think like Brendan said, right? I mean, we've witnessed some fairly fundamental change in retail post-COVID. I mean, we haven't seen this type of change ever, right? In many, many years. You've never heard of grocery actually being 10% of the business being online, or for other retailers that are softline, soft goods, apparel type of retailers, over 30 or 40% of their revenues are coming from online. And what that has done is that completely changed the game. People used to talk about competing with Amazon, but now you have to become Amazon. And if you start to think about how Amazon operates and start to deconstruct how you have to operate in the real world, there's a world of difference. For example, Amazon is not shaking hands with vendors to decide what products to carry. The listing and delisting of products is happening using data and algorithms. What products are actually shown and what products win what they call as the buy box is completely determined by algorithms as well, right? So if you start to deconstruct what a modern retailer should look like, data and analytics is the lifeblood. And a lot of retailers are trying to figure out how to use the data that's otherwise wasted in the organization to be able to make these decisions fast, to be able to refactor their operations, change the supply chains, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing a rush of actually use of data and use of analytics across all the retailers that we're working with.
So, in years past, retailers are quite infamous for sort of taking on one business problem at a time and creating a sort of a series of point solutions. With the use of data, has that changed how retailers are sort of connecting all of these applications, or are they looking for a different set of applications that may have been very different than how they were thinking about it before?
So that's a great point, Matt. I mean, if you look at the old style retail operations, and I'll take an apparel retailer as an example, right? In the past, I would make a decision of how much inventory to move to a particular store, maybe 3 times a season, right? Then I would make a pricing decision once a month, right? I would actually make a decision on how to fulfill a customer order based on the warehouse inventory that I held for the customer. None of those things are actually valid anymore. right? Because the demand is disrupted. You have some stores that are partially open, some stores that are, completely open to the customers. Some customers actually change the way they shop. So your decision on where the inventory should be at any given point in time, how you should place the inventory, what inventory to unlock because I have a dark store versus actually I have, a demand in a particular store. All of those decisions have started to become a lot more interconnected. So the new systems actually have to start to actually bring all of these decisions, whether it's placement of the inventory, pricing, or picking of an inventory for an order. They all have to actually come from the same system. And while I'm saying that should happen, it's really path breaking. It's really new, and they have to start thinking about it that way.
Okay, Tom, getting you in here. What have you noticed in terms of what customers are asking you for, and how has that impacted your strategy and how you think about evolving the business going forward?
Yeah, Matt, great questions. And I think as Yogesh and Brendan kind of started out with, there aren't fundamental things that I think customers are now asking us for that they weren't asking for before, but the rate at which they're accelerating those plans against the trends and the dynamics that they already had in their strategic horizon has really accelerated. And I think we've many of us have seen that that acceleration is to the tune of 5 to 7 years in terms of embracing technologies that help automate, orchestrate, direct workflows. So one of the things we're seeing from our customers is, how can we leverage the core technologies we have at Zebra to help them deliver on the on-demand promise that they have to their customers. So I place that order online and I can get it fulfilled through whichever channel I like, and I can have that delivered in the most expeditious way possible. And that idea of kind of infinite selection delivered and closer to zero time, if you will, is certainly not something new. It's just the rate at which we've accelerated that future forward is really kind of put a lot of these things front and center. And so, kind of the core of your question around Zebra and how it's pivoted our strategy, the good news, for us and for our customers and for the industry is delivering on these experiences and driving the efficiency and not just getting to the democratization of data. It's not just about putting data and dashboards and visualization tools and BI capabilities into the hands of various individuals. It's about automating the decisions associated with that data. So digital decisioning, as it's become to be known, and being able to use all that data to direct and automate the right workflow. And the reality is all of that kind of capability sits on the foundation of visibility and mobility. If you don't have visibility to know where your people are, where your capital assets are, where your inventory is, and you don't have the mobility in the hands of workers to be able to deploy the insights you can, infer out of that data, then it's kind of all for naught. So the way we're really looking at it is we're building on top of our number one market share positions in visibility and mobility with acquisitions like Antuit, with acquisitions like Fetch Robotics, Reflexis, and all in the robot and software as a service space that layer up on top of that visibility and mobility capability to deliver those insights that our customers need. So that's been a big pivot by us, and it hasn't just been words. We've been putting close to $1 billion in capital at work in acquisitions and venture investments in those very specific areas.
So Brendan, getting back to you, question. A lot of times retailers, especially ones that are public, tend to make sort of short-term technology decisions, perhaps, and often, if not always, sort of related to a long-term strategy. But COVID and sort of really accelerated how companies are thinking differently about their business. And with that, I would imagine it's causing them to think differently about how they think about technology and the application of technology within their business. How should retailers be thinking about technology and analytics and hardware to continue to move their business forward?
Yeah, so let me bring a little bit of that together with what Yogesh and Tom just said there, because I think that's really important to understand is that it's dovetailing that with what I said earlier today, which was the idea that as companies are starting to look at their own business and try to understand their own business, trying to understand what do we need to do, analytics and data tools and insights become a core part of that. right? So some companies are going to have some troubles and struggles with demand planning and things like that. You've got some retailers, just as an example, that might have stores in one location, throughout the U.S. as an example in each city. But there are other places that have maybe 3 or 4 locations in a city, and they might be thinking more of like a hub and spoke model for like their omni-channel demand planning. So each of them would have different problems and different challenges. One of the things that the pandemic really uncovered is showing us what we really didn't know about our business. I mean, everything works fine when everything's working fine, right? If everything's going smoothly, then we don't really understand the challenges that can exist when exceptions happen, especially when they happen to the degree that they happened over the past 2 years. And so what companies really realized was that it's not about the technology that we have. It's more about the insights and the data and the information that we have. And are we able to assess the situation and the state of our business in real time? Many organizations can. And that doesn't really matter what model you're in. But what they started to realize was that maybe we went a little too far with automation. Like, this is kind of a controversial statement I'm going to say here. But the reality is that we don't need just automation. We need tools that provide us with the insights in order for us to make smarter business decisions, because you could very easily automate yourself into stupidity as an organization. If you automate everything, you don't know what's going on, then how do you know what to improve? More importantly, how do you know what's failing? How do you know what's broken, right? If you just never look at anything or never understand anything. Dovetailing that with the physical environment, which I think is very important right now. And when I talk about physical environments, I am talking about the store primarily, but I'm also talking about warehousing and other things like that. The reality is that organizations today found that people and processes weren't as buttoned up as they thought they would need to be in order to address the situation of an entire supply chain breaking apart. And so what they found is that we haven't really digitized our physical locations well enough to really create workflows that can manage exceptions, that can work in environments that are fluid and that are changing constantly. They're designed for batch processing. They're not designed for real-time things. They're designed for Monday morning printouts that I have to read every morning and go through, not real-time in my hand mobile delivery of information that allows me to change my job on the fly. And so you can see the convergence of these two things about insights and understanding and creating fluidity and digitizing the physical environment. They really do go hand in hand, especially in an environment where the world is changing so fast and rapidly, and situations call for different kinds of solutions at different times.
Tom, you brought something up interesting about the democratization of data. And one sort of critical piece of the democratization of data is assuming that organizations have the ability to actually use that data and do something with it. Maybe Tom and Yogesh, as you guys sort of interact with customers, how do you feel organizations what is the readiness you sense in the industry around the ability to really use data to do analytics or digest analytics and create insights that are actionable in the business?
Yeah, I mean, I could start off and let Yogesh jump in, but I think Brendan's comment there I really want to focus on for a moment is the state of our business in real time. Being able to understand the state of your business in real time and then do something about that when it matters. Because I think, collecting all of the data, understanding what that means and doing something about it after the fact, if you're in business, you're already doing that, right? I mean, that's kind of, a traditional BI ways of operating and using, creating better standard operating procedures as a result. But where Brendan was going is, hey, I'm able to understand that in real time, and then I'm able to intersect that somehow in the workflow. And it could be a very simple process-oriented thing. It doesn't need to be something complex, but you're definitely not going to do that if you're operating just off of dashboards and reports. And even if those reports, they go from the green bar paper to their to regular paper to their digitized, and they're in an app even, and presented in mobile first based ways. That's still a lot of interpretation by that edge worker that's got a lot of other priorities going on during the day. So if you can kind of extract from that, what should you actually go and do about it? And you can create consistency, across thousands of locations and distribution centers and warehouses. Then you can do really two main things, I think. And that's a lot of, what our customers need to do at the same time, which is they need to create better experiences for their workers and their customers, while at the same time doing that and delivering their promises in a much more efficient way. And I think if you look at the old way of doing things, you can solve for one side of that equation, right? You can become more efficient, but you're probably not going to have a better experience. Or you can have a better experience and you're probably going to spend, more operating dollars to do it. To do both at the same time, you've got to embrace, this idea of, maybe to say the way Yogesh was putting it and Brendan was putting it, is offload the intelligence to this AI and machine learning type platforms, and then reintroduce the insights from that and let people do what they do best, which is, make the final decisions, adjust for exceptions, and just go get the job done.
Yeah, no, I think it's an extension to your earlier question and the comments Brendan and Tom made. I mean, I think fundamentally, right? I think when you look at data and the way the customers collect the data, and customers have collected this data, mind you, they have been collecting the data for a long time. It's not that they have not been collecting the data. I think the bridge to the last mile of how do I convert that data into decision is where the challenges are. And, some of those decisions are high velocity decisions. I'll give you an example. With one retailer that we work with, we are trying to transform the mindset. But like Brendan said, Monday morning, every executive gets printed reports, even today, for them to operate the business. The time is gone where you can actually do, run a business like that quite easily, right? As an example, today, when I have 1 million customers and I have to actually deliver so many customer experiences for them as they interact with my brand, right? They're in the store or they're receiving some offer or I have a new launch. None of those things can be orchestrated by human beings anymore, right? So those decisions, the data should have made for you and made it easier for the business to actually cockpit whether those decisions are actually creating the right kind of response from the customers or not. There are other decisions that are high value decisions. I'm buying something for a season. I'm investing millions and millions of dollars. Well, let AI make me intellectually lazy. In a sense, it should not be telling me what I did last year, but it should be saying, you had COVID, you had 30% store closures. Let me actually refactor your number based on all of those conditions and give you a better starting point. And now you can say, I should be investing money in these products, distribute the products this way, and so on and so forth. So there is actually a spectrum of how you can automate decisions across a retail enterprise using the data that you've collected. But it's not one end or the other. It's not a full automation, and it's not fully actually giving them the information in their hands for them to actually look at everything. It's actually taking different decisions that happen in different velocities within an enterprise and finding the right solve for it. And frankly, a lot of companies are trying to actually understand how to do that.
So, Brendan, as you think about it, what you've heard and in sort of looking at the industry, what organizational muscle do retailers need to build to really take advantage of all of the uses of data, all of the opportunities that are sitting out in front of them, and how the business is changing in the next few years?
I've been studying this for about 7 years. The idea of why are companies, despite following best practices and seeming to do the right thing, they still aren't very successful. And what I've uncovered is that most companies today don't have what I would call a data strategist in the organization. And what I mean by that is they often have someone in charge of data storage, data security, data sourcing, even data sharing. But to continue that little combination of DS, data strategy, that fifth S there, is something that most companies don't have. And what I mean is someone in the organization that says, what don't we know? And if we did know this, what could we do with it? Who in the organization really makes that decision? Because often it's just left to e-commerce will figure out what data they need, and stores will figure out what data they need, and marketing will figure out what they need. And no one really has a proactive approach to saying, but what's the information we could use? If we had it, we could take action on it. That to me is a big missing component in an organization today. And so I think what's happening is not only do people not have what I call a proactive data strategy, but they also don't have the individual in the organization that's able to work with data and understand data and interpret that data into business actions and be able to say, well, this is what this really means and this is what we should do about it. Or here's a group that probably should use that data, or here's the group that should use that data, right? And sometimes it's you collect data in one place and use it in another place. And when I've been doing interviews for the last year on that exact topic, and when I ask people, name the person in your organization that's in charge of your data strategy, as I've just described it to you, and nearly 9 out of 10 companies I've talked to say, we don't have that person. So now you understand why they're struggling. They really don't know what's going on because they don't have a person there that's able to look at data and be able to talk to human beings at the same time and be able to say, well, this is what this really means. And this is what we should be going after. And this is what we should be looking at. I mean, who's in charge of saying, how much time do people spend standing in line when they're picking up an order at a store? Who's in charge of that? Is it the head of store operations? Is it the head of omnichannel who usually sits in the digital team, right? There's nobody that owns it. There's no ownership of a data strategy in the organization, and that becomes a problem.
Yeah, I know that, for many years I've said, and I've tried to organize my own teams in a way that sort of poses the right business questions, then figures out where that data lives so that we can solve them, then organizes the data so that we can make it usable, and then present the information so that users can understand how to take action with it. And I think that's from my own experience, it's always been a critical capability for me. But I also know that that's not very typical in most organizations. And I think I've always said, find somebody who can find the data, can organize the data, present the data, and you've gone a long way in trying to solve the business problems. And also, by the way, implement software and talk to software providers in terms of how you want to solve the business problems and being educated that way. And also making sure that you actually select the right software to solve the right problem. And I think a lot of times people think, we need a technology solution without having a real good handle on the business problem and a deep understanding of the business problem.
And I'm gonna add a prelude to what you just said, which is when you say find the right data, the presumption is that you have someone who also is in charge of making sure where would we go get that data if we didn't have it.
Yeah.
Right. Like a lot of times it's like, well, who's in charge of making sure that we build customers' paths to purchase in ways that we understand them better? Are we building workflows for employees where we do trigger off things that help them understand their workflow and their workload? Who's in charge of making sure that we collect the data? It's not just about, do you have it in the system? If not, then too bad. But it's more about someone who says, we need to have this stuff in the system because we could do certain things with it if we had it. So how do we create those digital touch points, both operationally and through CX, that creates a better understanding of how our business, that state of the business I referred to earlier, in real time?
Yeah, that's tremendously insightful. So Yogesh, over the sort of evolution of retail, and I would imagine most industries, we go from this idea of like data transparency and democratization, and we sort of, in the early mid 90s, we had this idea of this black box and trying to sort of break open the black box so everybody knew exactly what was going on. But how does that square up with AI and AI solutions?
It's a great question, Matt. I think being a practitioner, I certainly see challenges that while AI is capable of solving problems that weren't able to be solved before, meaning very high volume, high capacity data can now pass through models on very large cloud environments, and we get a decision coming out. But the downside of some of this AI has been, at least reported everywhere and talked about everywhere, which is what you're alluding to, is the new machine learning algorithms actually have a black box nature to them, meaning they come out with an answer, a very good answer. But if you ask me why this answer is the way it is, it's a lot harder because you actually have very advanced algorithms that are processing the data. Having said that, I think I sort of want to talk about the same thing that Brendan talked about, which is every time you make a decision, and it could be any decision that you make, whether it's the order size, the amount of inventory you're moving from DC to store, you could always supplement that prediction with other things that actually give you that insight. Last week, your sales was this. Your seasonality pattern looks like that, right? Your customer demand from online looks like this, and helps anyone that's making that decision understand why that decision is the way it is, right? So we have to focus on not just the prediction itself, but focus on a lot more knowledge around that prediction so that people can actually consume that decision in a much more effective fashion. I think it's a very underrated and important point that a lot of people miss. They think it's all about the prediction, not about the human being that's consuming that prediction. And I think if we actually can solve for both, I think we'll see better days of AI adoption.
And as from a user standpoint, and people who's managed a lot of users, I actually think that sort of quote unquote distrusting systems is not necessarily an unhealthy thing, because a lot of times that distrust is what uncovers opportunities and potential for insights. And so I think questioning a lot of times the outputs and really getting detailed around what's driving them not only makes the organization better, but I think it helps us really sort of, refine and tune the tools that we're using to get the best possible outcomes. Because I always say people have a point of view for a reason, and 80% of the time they're right. We just don't always know order of magnitude and and how important those issues are. And so having healthy relationships with either an analytics team or a software provider, I think for me has always been nearly at the top of my list when I make software decisions. Tom?
Matt, can I just say
Yogesh?
one point out? Yeah, sorry. And I think it's you touched upon a very important thing there. Every prediction finally is for a business benefit. So what best practice in the industry would be is that if I'm actually using an AI system for inventory management, then I should know that there are certain KPIs, right? Whether it's my turns, whether it's my sell through. If I'm using an AI system for pricing, it's my margin, as an example, should improve as a result of using that system. The best way to actually do this is also build those business measurements in place over a period of time to see that, yes, I actually use a prediction. It should actually get me to that goal in a much smarter way. Am I reaching my goal? Am I seeing a 50 basis point improvement in margin? If it's not doing what it's supposed to do, something is broken. So instead of actually just questioning the prediction, you should question the end-to-end process. How are the users consuming that prediction? Are they doing something with that prediction that they should not be? Because ultimately, this is all for the benefit of the business, right? So I think that's the measurements is an important piece of bringing the benefit to the organization.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So Tom, with the acquisition of Antuit, what are you most excited about bringing to the market?
Yeah, Matt. So, maybe tying a few different pieces together, and perhaps it's apparent at this point, but the thesis, when you look at Reflexis, you look at Antuit, around those acquisitions, is saying that the planning systems that retailers are using today and the execution systems that they have, the lines between those two are just blurring, and they're getting closer, and planning and execution are becoming closer and closer together, actually to the point where a streaming plan is really your execution and the information that we want to get to the right person to help them get their job done. So the way that we've looked at this is, hey, we're already at the edge, with devices, with visibility, with things like RFID and computer vision technology that can help capture the state of what's going on. But that actually, creates more of a problem. I mean, as Yogesh and Brendan were saying, more visibility is not what people are asking for, right? If they can get more visibility that helps make the outcomes better, then that's something that everybody's on board with. So what we really saw is, to get maximum leverage out of the visibility we already have, we needed to bring, some of these tools together that can ingest that visibility and then help create the better recommendations, the better insight of, what should be executed and when and how and at what price and what location and where should inventory be fulfilled from, and all of these things that the permutations of, I think Brendan was saying it earlier, Yogesh alluded to it, have just become so complex that they're not manually, able to be handled anyway. So if you look at the number of routes to an end customer today, it's well over 3,000. When you look at the number of permutations in terms of the way you can order and pick and pack and ship and, and ultimately fulfill to that end customer, figuring out, which one of those 3,000 paths times the number of SKUs you have, it's just not really an option. And so we saw the opportunity to take the Zebra visibility capabilities along with the best of breed machine learning AI platform that Antuit has around demand sensing and demand forecasting, and bringing those two systems together to really make each one of them better. So, the demand planning from Antuit sharpens our focus on which data do we go and collect. I think Brendan mentioned the data strategy. So, what data is the most important to that AI ML engine as opposed to just spewing data out? And then by witnessing how well those recommendations are implemented, we can feed that back in to ultimately make the plan better. So that's really where we see the opportunity. And we are. We've been really clear with Yogesh and the Antuit team that this is an investment, right? So we're putting more R&D dollars to a pretty significant tune into the Antuit proposition than Antuit had standalone to go make all this happen.
And Yogesh, similar question, which is now with, as close to live data as you can get, how does that unlock value for the solutions you provide and the analytics that your team does?
It's a great question. I mean, ever since the acquisition has happened, I think we're hearing a lot from the customers on how these two things come together. So as an example, retailers are asking that Zebra devices provide us with the inventory visibility. You are actually planning the amount of inventory that goes to a store or a particular location. Can we actually tie those two? Because the accuracy of inventory information was missing in our earlier answer. So can we not tie this together? Or for that matter, today retailers make a lot of fulfillment decisions for an online order from a store without the knowledge of whether the labor in the store is capable of doing the pick, pack, and ship, right? Or capable of finding inventory in the sales floor. So can you now tell us, based on the intelligence that you have about how much labor is scheduled, do they have spare capacity, and so on and so forth, whether those decisions can now become more intelligent? So we are already seeing, the collapsing of planning and execution, as Tom calls it, or come up in our conversations with the customers, and we're definitely starting to work with some of them on how what the future looks like.
Yeah, and I recall, we launched buy online, pick up in store, and we were really surprised by two things. One was how much people wanted that service offered to them, which then had the second impact, which surprised us, which it was how unprepared the store was to actually house that inventory and service those customers when they came in the store. And so it became a bit of a learning curve. But as obviously as COVID happened, you also had things like fulfill from store, and all of these things really challenge how the store operates, how it's designed, how it interacts with the customer, and it's a big paradigm shift that needs to be addressed. Brendan, last question and the most important question.
Oh.
In the new retail battlefield, what's going to define the winners versus the losers?
Yeah, this is a really interesting space, and I'm going to say something a little controversial right now. The reality is that today's consumers know that they can get products anywhere. When I ask a consumer, where do you buy a blue shirt or a coffee maker or whatever it is I ask, doesn't even have to be in retail. It could be a 529 college savings plan. It could be what we find is that the experiences is what win customers. And the only way that you can get experiences right is to understand your customer and to understand what's going on in your business and understand their pain points and their preferences and their needs and respond to them in real time, right? All of this leads to this idea of using AI and machine learning to better understand what's going on, better understand your business. And what I find is this is fascinating to me, is that 68% of retail and wholesale purchasers said that they were going to invest in AI machine learning solutions in 2021. Great. But then you got to ask yourself, as an analyst, I always do this, well, what about the other 32% that said they weren't, right? Well, what's the thing that they're missing? What is the thing that they're not understanding about the future? And what I think people don't realize is what the potential for AI really has, which is to move from predictive tools to prescriptive tools. And the reason that I bring that up is because, for example, I'm a trained chef. Okay. I went to culinary school and, I was a French trained chef. So I know how to put together a wonderfully souffle and all these kinds of things. Right. But for all I know, the best tasting thing in the world may be shrimp, bourbon, and pickles in a blender, right? For all I know, that could be the best tasting thing to appeal to our palates, right? But I wouldn't think of that because I wasn't trained to do it. What people who are missing the big story about AI forget is that people are limited in their ability to understand situations. So when I'm planning inventory, I may be thinking as an inventory planner, okay, well, I got to look at last year, but I got to discount that. So maybe I'll merge last year with the 2 years before and all this kind of stuff. I'm taking a guess at it, right? I'm using what I was trained to do, but I have bias and I have limitations. The beauty of AI is it really opens up the door for us and looks at things that we wouldn't even think to look for that may have impact on the things we're going to decide, like what was just brought up a minute ago about labor. And what about a store's ability to actually, what's their rate of being able to fulfill on time, or not reject orders because of inventory problems, right? Or things like that. There's a lot of unstructured elements that in today's day and age need to come into the equation to better understand your customers. And so to me, this is where the competitive landscape lies. It is, how smart are you? Not how automated are you, but how smart are you in those moments that you need to be smart? That doesn't mean every time, but it means how well are you able to use your tools to help you get to prescriptive levels of understanding not what could you do, but what should you do, given an outcome that you want to achieve.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to wrap this up. A lot to think about, obviously, and we really appreciate the points of view from all of the guests. So thank you, Tom, Yogesh, Brendan. We really appreciate it. All-star crew of guests, and great conversation. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks.
Yep.